Thank you very much, Radhika. It's great to be back here with all of you. My name is Ju-Hyun and I am with Norton for Korean Community Development. As other comrades have addressed, the rise of multipolarity is creating new fault lines and deepening existing ones around the world. Today, I want to talk about one of those fault lines, which is Korea, a country that has now been divided for 77 years. Earlier this week, on Sunday, the DPRK, or the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, tested 8 ballistic missiles off of Korea's east coast. The next day, the United States and South Korea responded by firing 8 missiles of their own into the sea. This is just the latest exchange in over a year of escalating tensions. The capitalist press is already hard at work portraying North Korea as an irrational nuclear aggressor, and the State Department is raising the alarm over the possibility of another nuclear test from North Korea later this year, which would be its first since 2017. Yet the roots of Korea's so-called nuclear crisis, which I prefer to call a crisis of national division, lie in US diplomatic obstruction, South Korean militarization, and of course, the long unfinished Korean War. As US power declines and a multipolar order dawns, there are new perils and new opportunities arising in Korea that have wider implications for the region and the overall direction of the world system. So over the past year, a new arms race has been playing out in Korea. The situation has been building for some time, and South Korea's role in it with the backing of the US needs to be explained. South Korea's previous president, Moon Jae-in, was probably best known internationally for pushing diplomacy with North Korea, but he was also a defense hawk, like every liberal South Korean president has been before him. So while preaching about the need for dialogue, Moon also increased South Korea's defense budget by 30% to $54 billion a year. While calling on the United States to declare an end to the Korean War, he struck deals with US companies like SpaceX to build a South Korean Space Force. And while wagging his finger at North Korea's weapons tests, Moon tested South Korea's first submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and also put the military on track to acquire nuclear submarines and build a Korean version of Israel's Iron Dome. Now, Yoon Suk-yeol, the new conservative president, has only worsened matters. Just 1 month into office, Yoon has held a summit with Biden, attended working group sessions of the Quad, an anti-China military alliance between Japan, the United States, India, and Australia. He has pledged to resume annual joint military exercises with the United States. These are war drills where tens of thousands of troops at a time simulate invasions of North Korea just a few miles from the DMZ. And he has also strongly touted South Korea's so-called kill chain doctrine, a military plan to decapitate the North Korean leadership with a preemptive strike in the event of a suspected attack. All of this is why North Korea has conducted 18 missile tests this year. South Korea's military advances have changed the balance of forces, and the North has to respond. North Korea's artillery cannot reach South Korea's missiles if they are being launched from submarines. And with nuclear submarines and a space force, South Korea's military will have a much wider global reach, making it a more potent asset for the US and emboldening imperialist aggression. To counter this, North Korea has developed missiles that can be launched from mobile platforms to undermine South Korea's kill chain doctrine. They've also successfully tested hypersonic missiles that can evade most US missile shields and strike any of the US's military bases in Japan. This state of affairs is a sharp pivot from recent history. It was just a few years ago that North Korea and the US under Trump met in Hanoi and Singapore for high-level talks. These talks led nowhere. North Korea has always maintained that it is open to taking steps to denuclearize in exchange for binding security agreements and relief from the worst of US sanctions. The United States has always rejected this proposal, and Trump was no different. This is because the US is not interested in negotiations. It wants a full surrender. This reality didn't change when Biden took office, so North Korea is back to weapons testing because the US has slammed the door to diplomacy in its face and is now fueling the South in the arms race. Since 2017, North Korea has honored a moratorium on nuclear weapons testing. And if a nuclear weapons test happens later this year, it will be a sign of how badly the US squandered the last opportunity for dialogue. As multipolarity rises, the US's interests in keeping Korea divided and subordinated are only intensifying. The US military considers Korea part of its forward line of defense, 6,000 miles away from the mainland. The largest US military base outside of North America sits in Pyeongtaek, South Korea. The US stations 28,000 troops in the south and basically externalizes many of its military costs, including civil violence and environmental destruction, onto Korea and its people. For decades, the United States imposed restrictions on South Korea's ability to develop its navy or build missiles, but in recent years, those restrictions have been relaxed, which is helping to drive the new arms race. This is partially motivated by the fact that the South Korean military serves under the command of the United States in wartime. The South Korean army has 600,000 active duty troops at any given moment. In the past, limiting South Korea's military capabilities helped to keep it dependent on the US for defense. But today, expanding South Korean military power is a way of bulking up the US position. As potential flashpoints with China multiply across the Pacific, from Taiwan to the Solomon Islands, we can expect the United States will do everything in its power to deploy South Korean naval and ground troops to its side in the event of a war. This has long been the US security equation in Northeast Asia. The US provides air power and dollars, Japan provides bases, mostly in occupied Okinawa, and South Korea provides the cannon fodder. It is not an accident that out of these three countries, only South Korea has compulsory military service, while for decades, Japan, officially at least, had no military at all. So without Korea, the basis of US power in the Pacific would be seriously compromised. And that is why the US will not accept reunification unless it is the South absorbing a collapsed and defeated North. Korean sovereignty cannot coexist with US imperialism. So South Korea is crucial to US tech supply chains as a producer of semiconductors and as a major captive market for US and Japanese business. And finally, the status quo of permanent division and war provides a good rationale for the wider deployment of US troops in the Pacific to encircle Asia's rising powers. Multipolarity is, on the other hand, also producing contradictions that could undermine US power in Korea in the long term. China became South Korea's top trade partner almost 20 years ago. Contradictions are growing between US imperialism and the Korean national bourgeoisie. This is another factor driving this arms race. Military independence is increasingly seen in some circles as a necessary investment against US decline. Ultimately, US hopes of decoupling South Korea from China are probably a fantasy because South Korea simply has too much to lose from doing that. In the short term, the reactionary Yoon government will cement the neo-colonial US-South Korea relationship. But after that, the US's ability to hold this relationship together through economics alone is in serious doubt. The failure of Biden's recent launch of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework is one indication of this. But one solution to this long-term problem for the United States is war and the preparation for war. Now, of course, Korea's bourgeoisie is not the only source of contradiction with imperialism, nor is it the most important one. For the moment, South Korea's left is fractured and in retreat, but the workers' movement remains organized and militant, and the objective conditions for its resurgence exist. The 25,000 member truckers union in South Korea just went on strike this week over rising fuel prices. Since the 90s, neoliberalism has reduced almost half of South Koreans to the status of precarious workers and created overlapping crises in housing, education, healthcare, and beyond. A generation has grown up in formal bourgeois democracy to find that their personal hopes are stifled by capitalism and their country's destiny is still chained to imperialism. The failures of the Moon administration have disillusioned many people, and there are powerful worker, peasant, student, and progressive movements that exist in our advancing class struggle, although there is a need to work towards establishing a broader unity. Where South Korea's working masses go from here will shape the entire peninsula's future. This era is also creating opportunities for North Korea. Recently, Russia and China vetoed a UN Security Council resolution to impose new sanctions on the DPRK. This is a first for both countries and a very welcome development. As international trade in rubles and renminbi become more common, especially in the context of the Ukraine war, North Korea may be able to expand international trade and further develop its productive forces. These are great prospects, but the timescale is uncertain, and North Koreans know from history they cannot depend on others for their own freedom. This is why military defense remains a priority, because it is the most assured and immediate means of realizing and protecting North Korean independence. What we can say for certain is the revolutionary Korean project will endure. US prophecies of collapse have proven to be quite hollow. Under socialism, the people of Northern Korea have rebuilt from war. They have endured and returned from the fall of the Eastern Bloc, when a combination of the US blockade and environmental disaster reversed decades of developmental gains almost overnight. They are still striving to improve their standard of living every day in the face of endless US aggression. On the other hand, under capitalism, the people of the United States have only to look forward to endless war, pandemic, mass killings, incarceration, debt, and instability. So we'll see which society collapses first. Now, the transition to a multipolar world does not mean the end of imperialism by itself, but twists and turns in the world system do mean epochal changes for individual countries. With Korea, it was the transition to a world imperialist system in the 19th century that reduced our country from an independent kingdom to a colony of Japan. It was the catastrophic rise of the United States in the 20th century as the world's dominant imperial power that tore Korea in half and provoked a war that killed 4 million of our people, a war that still has not ended. And since the 90s, unipolarity has meant IMF structural adjustment and neoliberalism unleashed in South Korea, and it has meant brutal siege tactics against the North, and all at its most vulnerable moment since the Korean War. Today, the rise of multipolarity is creating new opportunities for North Korea, complicating the South's relationship to the US, and making imperialism more desperate to keep Korea divided, occupied, and controlled. A socialist pluripolarity that ruptures the US imperialist system could create openings for peace, reunification, and sovereignty in Korea, but this is not guaranteed to be an easy road. War is the final card in the US's hand to reverse the tide of history, and there is very little chance that Korea could escape such a war. The United States will try to drag South Korea in wherever the conflict begins, and the North will not sit on its hands while the US wreaks havoc in its neighborhood. We can hope that the combined military capacities of China and North Korea can sufficiently deter the United States, but ultimately defeating imperialism is everyone's responsibility. It was the Palestinian revolutionary Hassan Kanafani who taught us imperialism has laid its body over the world, the head in Eastern Asia, the heart in the Middle East, its arteries reaching Africa and Latin America. Wherever you strike it, you damage it, and you serve the world revolution. So we must do everything we can to strike at imperialism from wherever we are and carry forward the torch of revolution. Everywhere we must strike as if the world depends on it, because it does, and we must strike as if we can really win, because we can. The United States is swimming against the tide of history, and it is up to us to be the wave pushing towards the future. Thank you.